CEO of the Leonardo DiCaprio Foundation, and I served as the Secretary of the California Environmental Protection Agency in the administration of Governor Arnold Schwarzenegger from 2003 to 2010. And this morning, I know in the seminars you've been talking about biodiversity, and a lot of the topics have related to individual species and their habitats. But some of the lessons from California that I want to take you through are what are threatening our biodiversity and what we can do to turn that around. So first of all, the impact of climate change. This slide, of course, talks about the impact of climate change on human health. And obviously, we are part of the diverse biology of this planet, so it's important to take a look at the impacts on us as well as on other species and their habitats. And it's especially important because what we found in California was that we could get more people involved and more people interested in these topics and in solving these topics if we made sure they understood that it wasn't something that was only happening in a faraway country, but it was happening to them. So these are all some of the impacts that you have seen, not only the severe weather and extreme heat and fires that we saw in 2017, the floods, the hurricanes, but of course the heat-related illness and asthma and cardiovascular disease and so on that comes with the impacts of climate change. And really the challenge is that we are out of time. The science shows that we really have to peak our greenhouse gas emissions in the next 3 or 4 years, and then we've got to bring them down very sharply every year thereafter. I think many of you may know about the Paris Climate Agreement that was reached 2 years ago, and that took 21 years to reach because the first organization of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change happened in 1992. And it took 21 years to get that far, and even though it's a really good agreement, it only goes about halfway to the goals of avoiding the worst consequences of warming, which is basically to try to stop warming of the planet at no more than 2 degrees centigrade. And we're hoping we can even do it before we hit 1.5 degrees centigrade warming. So these things happen very slowly, and yet we don't have much time. And when it comes to biodiversity, 6 plant or animal species disappear every hour. That's 1,000 times the rate of natural extinction. So we are out of time, and that's the reason that this webinar is going to focus on what we can do about it so that all of the species you're studying, all of the biodiversity you're learning about has a chance to thrive. I should just mention before we go on that I'm going to go through some slides here in about 10-15 minutes, and then happy to take questions. There are solutions, and this is kind of a busy slide, and we can make this one available. We can make the whole presentation available, and I know it's also being recorded. But the good news is that there's a low-carbon economy that is a growth market, that it's been steadily growing for many years, that renewable energy production now outstrips fossil fuel, coal, and other kinds of energy production for new power plants all over the world, that the cost of these renewable energy and clean energy solutions has gone down, and that, in fact, we've modernized a lot of our systems. Cars are a lot cleaner, and energy use is a lot more efficient, and those are things which make it possible to hope that we can actually hit some of these targets that were set in the Paris Agreement and avoid some of those worst consequences that I mentioned before. And the good news is that these kinds of things have good results. And before I get on to that, I'm just noticing somebody saying that we need the mic to be louder. Let me just see, perhaps if I put on my headset and use a different mic. Hold on just one second. See if this works better. One moment. All right. Is that better? Let's just see how that works for folks. I'll continue until okay, yes, very good. All right, so um, again, these policies and these ideas that we're talking about for solutions to climate change and biodiversity loss, they actually do work. And here's an example that the kinds of policies we put in place in California to improve energy efficiency actually work. This chart shows you how many kilowatt hours of energy we use in the United States per person per year. And the red line you can see is over 12,000 kilowatt hours per person per year is the average in the United States. But California is 40% less than that. And if you've been to California, you know we have great weather. In fact, today, I know there's a lot of snow throughout much of the Midwest, but it's going to be about 80 degrees here in Los Angeles. So we'll be using air conditioners and fans, no doubt. And yet we are 40% more efficient than the rest of the country. And that's because of policies put in place to be more energy efficient and to use renewable energy. So we know that these policies do work. And our future depends on the efficient use of this low carbon energy. But it also depends on the concept of ending waste. So you see here we're showing a planet that's overcrowded, and by 2050 we know we'll reach about 10 billion people. We're over 7 billion now. And everybody wants to live like an American. They want a nice house, they want air conditioning, they want a nice car. But as a result, we're overusing all of our resources. We're cutting down our forests at a prodigious rate, which is having an impact on biodiversity, of course. We are draining aquifers and groundwater systems. In Cape Town, South Africa right now, for example, you may have seen in the news that the city there is just about running out of water in about another month. They're literally going to have no water coming out of the taps. Sao Paulo, the largest city in Brazil, last year faced a similar problem where they were rationing water and were thinking about evacuating some of the city. So we're overusing these resources, and it's having an enormous impact on all biodiversity, but including our own survivability on the planet. So we really have to end the concept of waste. And in order to think about that, I want to ask you to look at these slides and just tell me which of these things, I'm going to show you some slides, tell me which of these you think is waste. You think this picture shows waste, this beautiful deer and forest? How about an army? Is that waste? How about this money? Or this beautiful landscape with water and trees? How about our children? Are we wasting them? Now here's something that we probably all agree is waste. A giant box and plastic wrapping just for one tiny thing. Anybody who's ever ordered anything on Amazon probably has seen something like this. Well, the answer is all of these things today are waste. And let me explain to you what I mean. Here, for example, we show that trees are being cut down, and they go into these paper and pulp mills. They get turned into things like this cardboard box. So obviously that's an impact on biodiversity because we're cutting down habitat to make those boxes. And then what about the plastic wrap? Well, it starts with an army marching around the globe to places like Iraq to secure the next barrel of oil, which then gets transported around the globe. A lot of it's spilling along the way, as we've seen with the Exxon Valdez or the blowout of the Deepwater Horizon in the Gulf of Mexico a couple of years ago. Goes to large refinery facilities, which are polluting air and water, and again, impacting biodiversity. Then it goes to a factory, which employs some people, that's good, to turn it into bubble wrap. And then, of course, that bubble wrap in that box, after we take whatever that little thing out is that Amazon sent us, where does it go? Well, in this country, about 60% of it goes to a landfill. That's why all of those things I mentioned before are waste. So the things that go into the landfill obviously are destroying the natural ecosystem because we've been cutting it down, we've been polluting it. It wastes money because obviously it costs something to create all that packaging and so forth. And it's hurting our future because all of you are going to be inhaling the foul air and drinking dirty water and living with the impacts of waste. And then you might say, but wait a minute, don't we recycle? Well, yes, but here are the rates of recycling around the United States, and the average is about 35%. So that means 65% of what could be recycled isn't. And so basically, you got to think about that not as throwing away cans and bottles and cardboard boxes. We're throwing away trees and minerals and other natural resources. And because we're polluting the air, we're throwing away our quality of life and biodiversity. And what about in Europe? We've heard that their recycling rates are much better. Well, yes, in a few countries they are, like Germany, it's over 60%. But the average is only 39%. Europe really isn't, as a whole, much better than the United States in terms of recycling. And then, of course, there's places in the developing world that don't recycle at all. And when we do recycle, how efficient is it? Well, here's an example of electronic waste. So every time we throw away a computer, a television, an old cell phone, much of that does have value, but it gets shipped all over the world to be broken apart so that some of the pieces can be used. And at every one of the stops that you see on this map, things ultimately end up in landfills. So imagine a world without waste. Think what that would do for biodiversity. So instead of cutting down trees like this, we could have forests and healthy ecosystems. Instead of people fighting over water and diminishing resources, we could have them planting diverse crops in regenerative, sustainable agriculture. And instead of the few jobs we have today, remember, if we're only recycling 35 or 40% of what we could be using, and the rest is going to waste, well, we could actually have far more sustainable jobs if we used our material that today we're wasting. And of course, air and water, our whole ecosystem would be cleaner, which helps biodiversity, but it also helps each one of us. And I think that the 21st century's gold rush is actually doing something with waste instead of putting it into a landfill. And I must tell you that the Leonardo DiCaprio Foundation works with a number of nonprofits that are tackling these issues. And everywhere we go, one of the organizations we support is the R20 Regions of Climate Action that was started by Governor Arnold Schwarzenegger, who I mentioned at the beginning I had the pleasure of working with as the Secretary of the EPA here in California. And even the Pope would ask every time we would visit, that every city would ask us, hey, can you help us with waste? Doesn't matter if it was in a developed country or a developing country. Every city seems to have the same problem. A lot of material that could be used is going into landfills or incinerators. So what's the secret to unlock this? Because if we can stop wasting all these valuable materials, we can be cutting down much less forest cover, we can be having cleaner air and water, we can be protecting biodiversity as well as our own sustainability on this planet. Well, the Chamber of Secrets, as I like to call it, is a zero waste campus. And the idea is that instead of trucking these things to a landfill, you take it to a materials recovery facility. We have several of them here in California. There's a few in other parts of the United States and in Europe, and are starting to take off in other parts of the world. And every single one of these things then gets separated using modern technology, which is much more efficient than humans and uses optical scanners and sorters and air blowers and various other kinds of devices to use technology to sort all of the mixed material that goes into your trash can and today goes into a landfill. And then all of those things can be recovered and reused. So a plastic bottle, the PET plastic that's in that bottle can be recovered and cleaned and turned back into another bottle. Obviously, things like paper and pulp can be reused. And organic material like food waste and yard waste can all be recovered and turned into fertilizer, into green chemicals, and back even into food. And here's an example. So imagine a truck full of organics, which could be things like food waste, green waste, meaning things from your yard, lawns, and so on. Pre-consumer food waste, which in America we have a lot of. So a lot of the fruits and vegetables you see in a grocery store actually never get consumed. They get a little bit brown or bruised or out of date, and they get thrown away. And wood, a lot of scraps of wood end up in the organics pile. Well, as you can see from those arrows, some of the things like pre-consumer food waste can go directly into animal feed, which then gets back into the food supply. And these other different wastes can be made into compost, into energy, and to other very valuable resources. So absolutely nothing has to be wasted. Here's another example, electronics. You all have a lot of electronics. We're sharing this webinar today with electronics. And waste recycling of electronics actually can take these things apart, and all of this can be turned back into useful products. And this is not some technology of the future. It's here today. This is an example. You can see some pictures here of trucks dropping off waste instead of at a landfill in one of these facilities, which high-tech facilities turns it into all of these valuable products. So my question is, could a cool job of the future be in zero waste, which at the same time as it's turning something that today is a liability into an asset, in fact, we could be not only protecting our biodiversity, but protecting the quality of life for all humans on Earth as well. And of course, recently, many of you saw Elon Musk launch his Tesla Roadster up into outer space, and that's very cool. And when you see somebody collecting waste, you might not think that's a similarly cool job. But now that you've seen everything we can do with those materials and how doing that would actually protect biodiversity, help us solve climate change, and protect our quality of life on the planet, I would ask you, do you think a cool job in zero waste might be in your future? And I'd say the answer is probably yes. So with that, I'll open it up to questions, and I'll see if I can spot them here on this little chat box down on the left. Let's see, am I looking at this in the right place? Okay, Brittany, say you're at a high school in the second largest district in the state. You're still incredibly behind in recycling. What would be the first step in really getting and backing in a recycling program? Well, first of all, you're asking the right question, which is what is happening to the waste today? So that's something that students might be able to do and do a good job of, is to do an audit of the waste that you have today. And the first thing, of course, is to reduce it in the first place. Source reduction, trying to get to identify things that shouldn't be going in the waste in the first place. And then educating your folks in school and educating a facilities manager and asking people, for example, to bring reusable water bottles instead of plastic water bottles, or reusable food containers if they're bringing lunch to school instead of wasteful styrofoam and so forth. So after you've reduced as much as you can, then certainly take a look at what happens to the waste. If your region doesn't have recycling, well, then there's not a whole lot you can do to separate the materials, but you could advocate in your city or in your school to set up a recycling program. If you do have recycling and it's just a matter that a lot of this isn't getting done in your school, then perhaps you and some other volunteers might be able to set that up and make sure that the materials do get separated and educate students about how to do that, so that when it goes out the door, at least the recycled material is going in the right direction. And then finally, I'd say take this webinar, take some of these slides and go talk to your city about doing a zero waste campus and ending the use of sending these materials to landfills. Let's see here. Rigid, is waste the foundation's main focus? No. So the Leonardo DiCaprio Foundation was founded 20 years ago. We're celebrating our 20th anniversary this year. Founded 20 years ago by Leonardo DiCaprio, and he started putting money into, from his own movies in his own pocket, into biodiversity, into species protection, habitat protection. And then over the years, as he added much more and got his friends to contribute to the foundation, he was very concerned not just about ocean and land-based habitats and species, but he realized that climate change was going to wipe out many of the gains that we have as we protect animals and plants and habitats around the world, that climate change was going to impact all of those, including acidifying the ocean and a variety of other things that I'm sure you're familiar with. So we added a climate program a couple of years ago. Many of you may have seen his documentary Before the Flood, where he goes around the world and looks at the impacts of climate change. So we actually work on all of those issues. But as I said, the reason I wanted to focus on waste today was many of the other seminars are focusing on particular species and their habitats and biodiversity of the planet, but I wanted to focus on what's harming the biodiversity, what's threatening it in the future, and what we can do about it. Let's see, I'm not missing any questions here. See, we have from Donna, our city has no recycling system. What can we do? Well, I would definitely go talk to your city council, perhaps even take this webinar, or we'd be happy to send you information and show them that they're missing an opportunity, that if you can separate all these materials using technology, you can create a lot of jobs. And right now, most cities actually pay to take waste away. So tipping fees, as they're called, to tip the waste into a dump somewhere, into a landfill, can be anywhere from $40 to $100 a ton. And it's a big expense for a city. So you can actually save that if instead you can encourage companies to come and set up these zero waste facilities that will use technology to sort and manufacture things from all of this material. So it creates jobs, creates tax revenue for a city, and gets rid of that cost and that liability. So I would try to educate your mayor, your city council about these issues, and try to encourage them to put in a zero waste campus. Now those things do take a while to set up, and of course takes capital to invest and so forth. So in the meantime, at least you can encourage your city to at least do recycling. Let's see, Deb P says, what recommendations do we have for you as consumers? Well, the first thing I'd say is what I mentioned before, which is source reduction. The things that go into waste that are harming biodiversity around the planet, causing us to cut down forests and create so much other devastation, really is, a lot of it is things like in the slide presentation where I showed you, we get a box from the store or from Amazon, and it's just all kinds of plastic and cardboard and other packaging. So first of all, try to refuse packaging in the first place by carrying a reusable water bottle, or reusable food containers for lunches and things like that. Make some of your choices when you're shopping. Make some of your choices based on, hey, if there's two products that are very similar, you're buying a pair of socks that are very similar, and one of them comes with a lot of packaging and one doesn't, pick the one that doesn't. As a consumer, try to make those choices that will reduce the volume of materials going into the landfill in the first place. Some of the worst, of course, are plastic, and you might not think about the little things that make such a big difference. But straws in beverages. How many times have you gone to a restaurant or a fast food place and they automatically give you a straw, and maybe you don't even use it and it ends up in the garbage? Or you use it once and of course it ends up in the waste. So things like that, you can refuse straws. You can just tell people in advance, don't give me a straw, don't give me extra napkins, don't give me those little packets of ketchup or whatever else it is when you're getting a hamburger. So first of all, just become a more knowledgeable consumer about how to refuse waste in the first place. And then of course, the next thing is try to think about the packaging and other materials that are recyclable. That's another important piece of it, is that more companies are trying to figure out how to make their products and their packaging more recyclable so that it's easier for recycling systems, whether it's just plain recycling or this zero waste campus idea that I've shown, whatever it is, to make it easier to recycle all of that. Kathleen F says, what kind of jobs do you get in zero waste? Well, first of all, of course, there's collection, which doesn't differ a whole lot from what we have today. But then, as we saw, in fact, maybe I can just go back a couple slides. Here we go. So, I know this is probably a little bit hard to see, but on the top there, on the left, is a picture of the truck just backing up and dumping the waste into a facility. On the right is another part of that facility. You can see all the machinery there, which when the truck empties the waste, bags of waste, mixed waste, it goes into a hopper that breaks it apart, and then it goes into conveyor belts where optical scanners take a look at every piece of material that's going underneath on the conveyor belt and understands what it is. So the scanner can tell if what's going underneath is plastic, paper, metal, what kind of plastic, and then it goes to a conveyor belt where the computer says, okay, I recognize that as a plastic bottle, I'm going to send it off in this direction. I recognize this as metal, I'm going to send it off in this direction. And then as a result, it goes down a series of conveyor belts until it gets cleaned and sorted and ends up at the other end as bales of cardboard, bales of paper, bales of certain kinds of plastics and so forth, which then can be remanufactured into new things. So all of that is highly technical, uses a lot of computer skills, obviously a lot of design and mechanical and engineering skills, and these systems are getting better every day. For example, waste glass is one of the things that's the hardest thing to recycle, even if you separate it or if you don't. And so it's a lot of the systems today grind the glass. They take bottles and other kinds of glass and they grind it up and then it ends up either in a landfill or maybe as part of cement. Well, now there's modern technology that was designed that uses sound waves to pulverize the glass, and it becomes a very fine, even grain, which can be used in high-tech abrasives and all kinds of other high-tech uses. So designing these different systems and the computer systems and so forth that use them are extremely valuable. And then, of course, there are other technologies that are coming along to make better use of all these materials, to clean them better and faster and cheaper, and then put them back into production. I'd say one of the biggest areas, for those of you that might be interested in chemistry and biology, would be to look at the organics, because about 50% of waste that goes to landfills today, whether you're in the United States or Brazil or South Africa, is organics, food waste, and a lot of that is food waste from farmers, where a lot of the production actually rotted in the fields, never got to the consumer because they didn't have enough, say, cold storage or other ways to get it to the consumer. Much of it in our country is wasted after people eat half of a meal, throw the rest away, or as I mentioned before, in a grocery store where they might throw away food because it's expired time-wise. So that's a great opportunity to turn those materials today into green chemicals. And a lot of things that we use today, cosmetics and various other products, are made of very toxic chemicals. And so there's a move today to try to source various green chemicals or natural substances, and many of those can be withdrawn or extracted from organic waste. So there's a lot of exciting development going on in that. Let's see, we also have a question from Donna. Wouldn't it make sense for the government to mandate the stop of plastic use for food, makeup, etc.? Absolutely. In fact, my wife, Leslie, she works on these issues, has worked in California and now all around the world to ban single-use plastic shopping bags. We've seen those things, and they're just terribly wasteful. And people can bring their own bags and use reusable bags. And billions of those get produced every year. So that's an area where government has started to take the lead. Unfortunately, the chemical and petrochemical industry fights back because they see this as an attack on their industry, which of course there's plenty of other better uses for plastic than using it once in a plastic bag and then throwing it away. Similarly, Styrofoam is one brand, but it's most familiar of the kind of foam uh, that we see in food containers and various other packaging that is used to absorb shocks when you're packaging glass and things like that. And that is very hard to recycle and really ought to be banned because there are far better materials for all of those kinds of things for food containers and so forth. See what else. Let's see. Then we have a question about best books. Well, this is a very interesting thing. I mean, there's actually not a lot of books written on this topic yet because it's fairly new. So maybe you can write one. Study the issues and take a look at some of the case studies that have gone on so far. But I think probably the most important issue to get people to think about is the fact that our consumer society is what's having such a big impact on biodiversity. And again, many of the seminars that you'll be watching in this teach-in over the next few weeks are going to be focused on particular habitats and animals, and we're not necessarily paying enough attention to what's stressing them. So everybody can understand if somebody's cutting down a forest, okay, well that's a stress on habitat or on a particular species. But the real reason is, why is anyone cutting down that forest? Well, is it because of wanting more land for grazing cattle so we can have a hamburger? Is it for production of soy, which is a big component in lots of products today? Or is it because they're cutting it down to make wasteful packaging that, as we've shown in the webinar here, is going to end up in a landfill? So I'd say the first thing is to make sure you educate yourself and, again, your city about these issues, and maybe you can be the one that writes that book. Let's see here. Then Brittany asks, does the DiCaprio Foundation have grants and consulting help or work with people in schools to start projects? We are a grant-making organization, so if you know a good nonprofit in your area that's working on waste and waste reduction and biodiversity, we would be happy to hear from them. We try to cover a variety of different topics from, in fact, here, let's see if I can show you this. Here's our latest brochure, which you can download online, and it shows our different areas of interest areas and sort of a history, a timeline of what the foundation has been doing and the various areas that we do make grants in. And as you see, one of the first ones is tackling the climate crisis. And as you can see, the picture chosen is not just a smokestack belching greenhouse gases. It's our natural ecosystems which are under threat, of course, from climate change and those sources of pollution. We don't necessarily work directly with schools, but like I said, we do work with nonprofits that work with schools and students. Environmental education is maybe the really most important thing we can all do, because we see today a lot of the choices that are made out of ignorance. So getting people to understand how systems work, understand biodiversity, understand solutions like the ones we've been talking about today is really critical. Let's see, then Kyle W. says, we know that we shouldn't create waste, and reducing the source is the best, but what are the viable alternatives to landfilling? Well, as I mentioned throughout this webinar, Kyle, and I don't know if you tuned in early enough to see the whole thing, but really today we don't have to waste anything. Nothing should go to a landfill, virtually nothing. These zero waste campuses that I'm talking about, these facilities that we have here in California, there's one in Texas, a few more around the world, and I think will take off, and you'll see in more places very soon, can actually harvest 85 to almost 90% of the material, of the mixed waste that comes in that would otherwise go to a landfill, and can harvest the recyclables out of that, separate it, clean it, and get all of that material back into productive use, into what's called the circular economy, where whether it's the food waste or packaging waste or things like used electronics, that things should be designed in such a way, and our whole system should be designed, that it's circular, that we are producing things, but then using all of that material again, that everything goes back into being either a technical or a biological nutrient, meaning a technical nutrient would be, say, for example, harvesting metal out of a computer and then putting that metal back into making a new hard drive or whatever it is for another computer. And a biological nutrient would be taking food waste and turning it back into feed for animals or other food production. So everything now, at least 90%, can be used productively if we apply the technologies I've mentioned here today, and nothing should go to a landfill, really. And Deb says, let's see, brother and sister team that we had as presenters last week, and they have the One Less Straw. Yes, a great movement. The name of their organization is One More Generation. You might already know them, but in case you don't, it's an inspirational. Well, that's great. And that's a very good example, because, a lot of these issues about biodiversity, about climate change, and even the solutions, when we talk about something as big as the waste stream and landfills, seems overwhelming. I was in Dallas a few weeks ago at the landfill they have there. It's 5,000 acres. I mean, most cities are not 5,000 acres. And it's a landfill that they're just trucks after truck after truck is just going up this hill and dumping waste, when in fact all of that could be put back into productive use. So I know it can seem overwhelming, but every journey of 1,000 miles begins with the first step, as the old Chinese proverb goes. And so every one of us can do our part by things like having one less straw, or refusing straws in the first place, or using reusable materials, and just making that decision that, okay, I'm not gonna ever accept a plastic water bottle again. I'm going to carry a reusable water bottle and refill it and that type of thing. We can all make a difference, and if everyone does it, it would actually dramatically change the world. Of course, nowadays a lot of light bulbs are LEDs, and people are replacing them. We just actually had a presentation last night of some streetlights in Los Angeles that actually were turned into a work of art, historic streetlights that were refitted with LED lights, and it saved 90% of the energy. So that means 90% less pollution from the energy production. And so obviously just changing a simple light bulb can make a big difference, and that's something you can do in your home today that will save you money, but it will also help save the planet. And then let's see, Donna, who just gone too far here on my little diapers. So diapers, feminine products, burn versus disposed. Well, excuse me. There is now technology in the UK that actually can sanitize and clean and separate all of that material, and at least turn it into energy with gasification, not burning it. If you burn it, a lot of pollution goes up into the atmosphere. But if you gasify it, which is high heat in the absence of oxygen, then you can actually break that down back into various gases, industrial gases that can be used for all kinds of purposes. So even there's really nothing on Earth that we can't. So even there's really nothing on Earth that we can't find a way to recycle or use. Excuse me. Mrs. O says, I read somewhere that California was trying to ban all single-use plastics. Do you think it's likely to happen? Well, we did it, thanks to my wife, Leslie Tamminen. During the Schwarzenegger administration, which ended in 2010, we introduced the first law to try to ban single-use plastic bags. And we were fought by the chemical industry, so we had to introduce it again. And unfortunately, the states didn't do it. And so my wife went from city to city, county to county, got 130 cities and counties in California to ban single-use plastic bags. And finally, at the state level, they said, okay, we can't have this patchwork, so let's make a state law. And then 2 years ago, the state law was passed, and immediately the chemical industry filed a ballot measure to try to overturn the law. And so last year on the November ballot, we had to defeat that, and finally did defeat that effort. And so now it is law in California to ban single-use plastic bags. Now, you'll still see some of them. There are certain exemptions for, a butcher shop, for example, that might have some meat that has to go into something sanitary. And there's a few other exemptions, but by and large, the majority of stores in California no longer offer them. Kyle, it says you showed in your graph recycling rates are at or above 90% in countries like Luxembourg and Switzerland. Would you say that these successful recycling systems can be attributed to strong infrastructure or a strong culture for recycling? How can my local community get there? It is, first of all, that it's law, first of all. I mean, a lot of those countries that have higher recycling rates, the ones you mentioned, and of course, some of the Scandinavian countries and Germany and so on, they do things like landfill bans, where they ban various products from getting to a landfill. So they might not ban the use of them or the existence of them, but they prevent them from going to a landfill. So things like waste tires, electronics, certain organic materials, and so forth. And then that incentivizes businesses to try to make use of those materials or reduce the volume in the first place. And that worked in California. We had a ban put in place on electronic waste going into landfills, but we realized that that would generate a lot of waste televisions, refrigerators, computers. I mean, imagine what would happen if suddenly you couldn't throw those things away that we used to throw away. So we imposed a fee when you buy a new television or refrigerator. You pay $3, $4, $5, $6, and as a disposal fee, or tires, $5, $6 for disposing of a tire. And then that money goes to the companies that are recycling. So that gives them the incentive to invest in the new technologies to be able to reuse all of that material right here in California. And it's led to the creation of many jobs. Taxpayers get a great deal because all those jobs and businesses create taxes. It reduces cost of landfills. So a lot of these things begin in these countries with not just strong recycling systems, and that is important, but by understanding what's in the waste stream. And I would go back to a question that we had earlier from someone about what you can do in your own school. And that's the first thing, is to understand, if it's a school or a city, understand what is in your waste. Do an audit of the waste. Try to understand what it is that you're dealing with in the first place, so you can then think about how do we reduce it and how do we recycle or reuse it. So Donna M is asking, we're part of a community bag project. Plastic bags woven into mats for people who live outdoors, feed bags turned into beautiful shopping bags, artsy bags. It's called bagshareproject.org. I don't know if everyone can see that, but if not, bagshareproject.org. And that's another great thing, is that we're seeing exciting new ways for a lot of these materials to be reused over and over again. I saw when I was in Mexico City last week, I saw a shop that had beautiful briefcases and shopping bags and purses, all made from old rice bags and really interesting old materials that were harvested and turned back into exciting products. One of our lawyers, Daniel Cooper, has a wallet and a briefcase made from bicycle inner tubes, and that have been recycled and repurposed, and it's fantastic. So yes, there are many things we can do with this. WP says, I believe Germany has a cradle-to-cradle policy. Could we establish such a policy in the U.S.? Yes. The Cradle to Cradle Institute was started by Bill McDonough, and that, by the way, is a great book. Earlier someone was asking some books to read. The Bill McDonough's book, Cradle to Cradle, is a great one because it does talk about how products can be better designed in the first place so that they're able to be used back again as a technical or a biological nutrient. And the book itself is made out of material that's more easily recycled. And he started an institute so that companies can have their products designed and certified as being cradle to cradle, meaning that they can easily be fully recycled back into the production stream. And so it makes people much more aware about how to reduce waste in the first place, and then how to turn these things back into useful products. Again, this is part of what's now called the circular economy. So I would urge people to look up Cradle to Cradle Institute, Bill McDonough, and his book Cradle to Cradle. And then Donna has provided the website for thebagsshare.org, THEBAGSHARE, thebagsshore.org. And as Donna M points out, this can be started anywhere. Very good. So let's see. We have from Horn, we have, what are some things that California does to control their waste that other states might not be doing? Well, one thing, as I mentioned, is the e-waste law, which bans electronic waste from landfills and then incentivizes the businesses that actually use that. Another one is our bottle bill. There's only 11 states today that when you buy a beverage in a plastic or a glass container, that charges you a fee, 5 cents, 10 cents, whatever, and then you get it back if you bring the bottle back and recycle it. And California has reduced the volume of wasteful bottles and cans dramatically, much more than the states that don't have those deposits. So that's one thing that you can certainly advocate for if you're in one of the states that does not charge a deposit for the bottles. And in California, what's happened is, of course, many people will buy a soda, beverage, a beer, whatever, and they pay the, 3, 4, 5 cents, don't even notice it really. And then they dispose of the bottle, or even maybe if they recycle it, they don't necessarily try to get their deposit back. So that leaves a lot of money in the fund, and then the state uses that to incentivize new ways to recycle and new technologies and new recycling programs, including grants to schools. So that's, if you're in California, something to look at is the Department of Conservation and their bottle bill funding program. And then one other area, we were asking about what else California does. When I was EPA secretary, we were looking at, first of all, we passed a law, and this was another thing some states don't do, that set a goal. In 1990, we set a goal that by the year 2005, so 15 years later, that we would have reduced waste going to landfills by 50%. States, cities would have to do that. They'd have to come up with ways to do that. So when I was EPA secretary in 2005, I had to look whether or not we had succeeded in that goal, and indeed we did. And then we were able, because of that success, we were able to set a goal of 75%. So in other words, against the 1990 baseline, 75% of what had been waste would have to be diverted or otherwise used. And so we started looking at what were the wastes that were still coming in. I mean, if we had figured out ways of using half, 50%, what could we do to get another half? And we realized that there were things like carpeting, waste carpeting from construction and demolition sites, and a lot of construction debris that's very hard to recycle. Busted up concrete that's mixed with metal and mixed with plaster and paint and so forth. So we incentivized companies to actually figure out how to break that material apart and put it back into production, and such that we were able to ban those materials from landfills as well. So it really comes down to understanding what your waste stream is, and then you can figure out what to do about it. Let's see, Kyle, not sure if this has been answered, but are there methods to take current landfills and separate the materials to be used to recycle? Kyle, that's a great question. I often talk about the fact I truly think that there will be a gold rush of the 21st century coming in the next 10 years. You're going to start seeing urban mining because every community has a landfill somewhere nearby that they've been burying their waste for decades. I know in Minnesota there's a place where the mound got so high that they even turned it into a small ski slope in the winter. And so yes, I do think all of those materials are there. Of course, the organics have probably been decomposing, and in fact, many landfills have methane that is released because of all the decomposing organics. In recent years, some of that has been captured and turned into energy, which is a good thing, but a lot of it just decomposes and goes into the atmosphere. And methane is about 25 times more potent as a heat-trapping gas for climate change than CO2. It doesn't last as long in the atmosphere as CO2, but it's much more potent when it gets up there. So again, that's a big contributor to climate change. And but there's a lot of plastics which will last for thousands of years in a landfill, metal and various other materials which can be harvested. And I do think you're going to see much more urban mining in the coming years, because it's getting harder and harder to go around the world to cut down forests, to dig up oil, to get these resources. And the more expensive that is, the more economically viable it makes it to get it from your own backyard from a landfill. Make sure I haven't missed anything. Yes, and shrinking our current landfills. And by the way, one of the biggest owners of landfills in this country is Waste Management Incorporated. You might see their trucks, WMI or WM, Waste Management. And we have encouraged them to turn every one of their landfills into a zero waste campus. So they get paid to pick up the waste from your streets. Let them still do that. Someone has to pick it up. But they could build these zero waste campuses on the landfill, and then the landfill, in essence, would last forever. Instead of having it filled and having to cap it and move on to another site and destroy another site as a landfill, you'd have this facility that would process all of the waste instead of burying it. And they'd have a business model that would last for decades. So we hope that landfills turn into these zero waste campuses. Debbie P., one of the things I often encounter as a science and environmental educator, people who are very defensive about changes and at times even say that resource consumption is a necessity of our economy and a human right. I imagine you run into similar people. How do you handle these people? Or do we provide evidence for our position and then ignore them? Or do we engage them? Well, we have to engage everyone. And certainly as educators, you have to talk to a lot of different people, and I'm sure even parents who maybe didn't get some of the education that's being provided to young people today. And I think that's why we have people who can still question the unquestionable science around climate change and who can ignore the fact that, as I mentioned earlier, 6 plant or animal species are going extinct on Earth every single hour, which is 1,000 times the rate of natural extinction. But most people don't know that. And of course, they have urgent needs in their lives. Excuse me, Maslow's hierarchy of needs. We've got to have our shelter, our food, provide for our families. So even if we're aware of these things, they don't rise to the top. So what we try to do, and in the Schwarzenegger administration in California, we tried to focus on the fact that, hey, the things that we're asking you to do for environmental reasons are things you should do for your own health and for economic reasons. So, for example, having a car that pollutes less is not somehow overreaching government or adding costs to buying a car. It's going to save you money in terms of saving fuel, and the emissions coming out the tailpipe today are about 98% cleaner than they were in the 1950s, and that's leading to cleaner air. And when you tell people that, for example, a child who lives near a busy freeway in Los Angeles loses as much as 1% of their lung function every year because of smog, that gets people awake and aware and wanting to do something about diesel pollution. And but otherwise it's something that perhaps you don't think about. So I try to always, when I encounter people who either deny the science or just not aware or it's not their priority, I try to explain things in ways that might make it their priority. And as we talked about today, some of the answer to biodiversity loss is going to be ending the concept of waste and solving climate change. And these are all things which will lead to great jobs. Let's see. So then Deb says it's exhausting at times and hard to determine where to focus our attention with detractors. Well, look, again, I think what's going on, these webinars, for example, are fantastic to educate people. And, when I was a kid, we first learned about recycling aluminum cans. That was kind of the first thing. And so when our parents would throw away an aluminum can, I'd run and say, Dad, you can't throw that away. That should be recycled. And that's how they learned. So and lots of other examples like that where I think young people are teaching older people. I know Christina Hambley, who works with me at the Leonardo DiCaprio Foundation, and I think is on this webinar right now. She's teaching me how to use a lot of these devices and social media to communicate with people. So all of us can learn, and I think the key thing is to find something that interests people, that makes them excited. And if they're interested in elephants in Africa, well, explain to them that one of the things that's going to destroy those elephants is our wasteful use of materials that's causing the habitat destruction and ultimately climate change that will destroy their habitats. So I think it's just a matter of trying to get more and more people to see things in their own self-interest, and then they're likely to perhaps do things more in a broader interest. Has the current administration, this is from Bridget, has the current U.S. administration quashed programs by defunding the EPA, or is most of the work being done in this field financed by corporations and nonprofits? In other words, should we worry that the momentum in the field of recycling waste is going to slow down? No. Well, first of all, the EPA is a disaster at the moment, and I'm sure we want these webinars to be nonpartisan, but let's face it. Scott Pruitt at the US EPA seems to be very hostile to the agency that he is there to run. Rick Perry, who is the Energy Secretary, has said he wants to close the Energy Department. When he ran for president a few years ago, he famously said he would close it. So you have people in government today who are very hostile to the very agencies that they're put in place to manage. And, I understand some people who might think that some agencies overreach in their regulatory regimes or impose too many fees. But, all you have to do is look at air quality back in the 1950s and compare it to air quality today. And it's the regulation and fuel economy standards and things like that that have given us cleaner air, less air caused diseases, asthma and lung cancer and so forth. And if we want to turn back the clock, we're going to look like New Delhi or Beijing. And you can certainly, if you're not familiar with it, Google air quality in those places because they don't have these regulations. And the list goes on and on. So we really need the EPA to continue to do its job. The good news is that many of the federal programs, like the Clean Air Act and Clean Water Act, are delegated to states. And so the states, in many cases, are still enforcing these laws. but we really have to continue to support those regulatory agencies to do their job. But then companies are absolutely stepping up, and I think they're understanding it as part of their bottom line. So, for example, several years ago, Walmart realized that it was paying a lot of money to send waste out the back door and through dumpsters. And they looked at the waste and they said, gee, a lot of it is cardboard and plastic, the packaging, the goods that come into a Walmart store before we put them on the shelves, they're in boxes and in packaging. And so they were paying over $100 million a year to throw away all of that material. And instead, they started recycling in the back of their stores, and it turned it into a $100 million profit center. So it was good things like that that companies are starting to realize they can do, not just for the planet, but for their bottom line. Well, listen, I think we've run out of time. We're at the end of our hour, so I want to thank everybody who participated. And if you have any questions, I think the organizers have a way to email us or just look at our website at the Leonardo DiCaprio Foundation. And we look forward to hearing from you and to having you be a part of a clean and zero waste future that will support biodiversity for all living things on this planet. Thank you.